Hello, everyone. Welcome. Week 9. We are here. This is, I'm going to say, the landing pad for what I have imagined for this class to be. The next couple of weeks are going to be um, kind of lighter topics, lighter reading, not as in intensive presentations, lectures, anything like that, to give you guys time to work on your final projects. But this week is the final week. This is the week that we are fully landing our we are ending our journey here with teachers this week. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this actually super applicable article here talking about a potential pay raise coming to Aurora public school teachers. So as part of the collective bargaining agreement, so we've talked a bunch about the CBAs, how important that is. It looks like most teachers in Aurora Public Schools are going to get an 8.5% raise. That's awesome. This raise, along with the commensurate raise that the classified and administrative staff of the district will receive, will cost the district around $30 million a year. That is significant, but Aurora Public Schools, being the second largest school district in the state, that is obviously an investment that they are willing to make. What I really want to focus on here is the conversation that both the president of the Aurora Education Association, as well as Superintendent Rico Munn, what they were saying about hiring and retaining teachers, right? This is going to be a huge theme throughout today, but they said that they have a staff retention rate of around 88%, which is not terrible. I mean, it's not good by any stretch of the imagination. You don't want to be turning over 12% of your staff, but it is definitely something that they need to keep an eye on. But they're more concerned, especially Munn is more concerned about hiring and attracting new talent, having a significantly less robust talent pool to hire from. That's a challenge that they're facing. Linnea Reed Ellis, who's the president of the Teachers Union, says that what she hopes comes from this pay raise is further support for teachers. She says that the conversation she has with teachers in Aurora, pay is one of those top issues. However, it's not the only issue, and so what I want you to be thinking about as we talk through today is this enough? And at the end of today's lecture, we're going to be interviewing a former Aurora Public School teacher who recently left the district, and we'll be able to ask her, is it enough? Would the 8.5% raise been enough to keep her there? So as we begin our journey here, be thinking about that as we go along. I do want to make sure my framing is correct. Yes, I know last week's lecture was it was off center, and so that made it for a weird reading experience or viewing experience. So make sure that's correct. So this is the final straw. This is it. This is everything that the class has been leading up to. Is this? We're talking about teachers. This is. I said, with districts is where the rubber meets the road. This is education. Education is produced by teachers. There is no education policy, there is no education system without teachers. So let's talk a little bit about teachers and how they fit into our larger conversation here. We'll start by connecting the dots a little bit. We'll talk about motivations and pressures. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, actually, so I'm super stoked to explore motivation theory with you. And then talk about the case study with the impending teacher shortage and kind of what we can do with that. There will also be an interview at the end, like I said, but we'll also spend some time talking about the final project as well. Make sure you're set up as we are coming up on that due date there. Readings, the assignment is on Perry and Wise and Goldstein. Goldstein, one of the best education books ever. Talking about teachers, talking about the experience of teachers in our education policy system. Perry and Wise is the seminal work on public service motivation theory, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And then there's some additional readings talking about the role of teachers in the classroom, the effect of teachers on the education policy system, how they kind of see themselves in the larger context as well. There are some optional readings this week. If you do have time, I would recommend skimming the teacher prep program review. That is a really, really dense, comprehensive review of like a meta-analysis of teacher preparation programs in colleges nationwide. It's really long. Don't read it all unless you really are interested, but skim it. It does have some interesting analysis there. And then there's a YouTube playlist I put together of some of my favorite videos talking about why teachers are leaving the profession. As we have many teachers in our class here, you'll be able to tell me as well as anyone why teachers are leaving the profession, right? All right, let's start connecting the dots here. So for everything that we've talked about, this is the last chapter. The next 2 weeks are going to be fun, little kind of like bonus epilogue type discussions, but this is the final chapter. This is it. This is where we land. Everything we've discussed, every concept, every policy, every theory, every system, means nothing without teachers. It is so easy, and you can watch politicians do it, to talk about ed policy, and to talk about the theory, and talk about, in really highfalutin language, what education means to our society and everything like that. But until we look at and understand the way that these policies impact teachers on the ground in the classroom, none of that discussion means anything. So what I want to do is I really want to torture this metaphor of this journey that we've been on and kind of discuss our major themes of each week through the lenses of teachers. So we start our journey with the history of education policy, the origins of many of the norms of our system, the tradition of local control. This was something that we saw that has huge implications for teachers. The fact that even states early in our country's history were not funding structured education systems meant that the only places that had schools were the ones that could afford to hire teachers or had parents, mainly mothers, that were educated enough to be teachers for those local schools. We also talked about education as the great equalizer, the Horace Mann comment, right? The great equalizer is something that is provided by teachers. It is that experience in the classroom that students are brought up. The theory is that any student from any background with any sort of trauma and disadvantages in their life can be brought up by their teachers through the education system. And then we also talked about how we've traditionally moved the goalposts with our educational outcomes, right? We started with our Committee of 10 report, how we wanted this really high quality liberal arts education. That was where we first started hearing this idea of like, we need high quality teacher preparation programs. That did not change, but the goal of our schools did. The cardinal principles took over, and we ended up with a larger story about pushing kids through to graduation. Obviously, that had an impact on our policy making in the late 20th century and early into the 21st century as well, and how we changed kind of what the purpose of our education was, even though teachers were expected to be the high-performing, high-quality individuals throughout it all. This is actually backwards, so that's great. If I had any video editing skills, I would change this. But we also talked about Lavery, right? The different goals of our education system, the social efficiency, the democratic equality, and the social equity. And how do teachers fit into that narrative? How do teachers, it is providing, as we talked about, the social efficiency, the ability to move up through the system. And then teachers are creating the citizens of our next of the next generation, right? They're the voters. That's why parents get really invested when they think that teachers are putting an ideology onto their children, right? We keep going through the history highway, and we talk about two major concepts and themes throughout federal policy, and we try to understand why the national government seems so incapable or ineffective at creating education policy, right? Well, the first was the federal government has made a decision over and over again that we want big, measurable goals. We want goals that are easy to understand, easy to put together, and easy to talk about on a stump speech, right? And that comes through standardized testing. Standardized testing has fundamentally changed what teachers do in the classroom. Teachers, whether or not they like it, they have to teach students how to perform well on those tests. And then we also talked about the federal government's inability to create equity, right? They pass massive, critical, critically important pieces of legislation, the ESEA, IDEA, No Child Left Behind, all with this idea of we're going to increase equity. We want to support these Title I schools, these students who are disadvantaged. And yet, because of their inability constitutionally or motivationally to affect education on the ground level, they're essentially just saying things. They're just making these grandiose statements about what equity means in our system without doing much to truly enforce it. We then journey through our states and we talk about the various ways that states govern schools. We talked about the power of the state funding formula, how important it is for not only students to show up to school, but also students to show up and perform well on these tests. We also talked about the role of the State Board of Education, that this is a governing board that exists in no other education universe, that the State Board of Education is a professional, highly technical administrative body separate from the Department of Education. They're providing that oversight. They're the ones seeing and analyzing what teachers are doing in the classroom. And then finally, we took a pit stop and looked at these two major entities within our system at the state level, teachers' unions and the private industry. So teachers' unions, obviously, a huge impact on teachers' lives at their workplace. Teachers' unions are critical to maintaining our balance of teachers showing up to the classroom. Teachers' unions are advocating. They brought the teachers' voices into the policy-making system. And as we read, that may be for better or for worse, right? And then there's also, we talked about how the private industry has embedded themselves into our education system. Teachers are not only preparing their students to take a McGraw-Hill or Pearson test, they're preparing them with Pearson study materials and Pearson test prep guides and using Pearson and McGraw-Hill curriculum, right? We briefly took an aside, had our midterm to kind of recap, and then we dove straight into school districts. And we talked about the division of politics and administration. This is really important because that level of division of politics from administration, I think, serves as a shield in a lot of ways for teachers. Teachers not having to teach in a political environment. Instead, they're teaching as they have been trained to. At least we hope they are. And then there's also pressures on districts. We talked a lot about school count days. That's something that teachers have to do too. They have to take time out of their schedules to make sure that they're having parties and doing fun things and doing personal outreach to chronically absent students. My wife did many house visits to go and talk to the parents and the families of some of her children, especially the ones that are either not performing well or were obviously having other issues outside of the classroom. And then finally, we journeyed into the minds and motivations of administrators, right? And how administrators have a really tough task of using their limited funds to balance those short-term and long-term decisions. Do we invest in infrastructure that is preventative, or do we continue to kind of mark time with making those short-term investments instead? And then we also talked about evidence-based decision making. This is something that teachers use all the time. Teachers are constantly using best practices and research to justify the way that they're teaching their content. This is something that comes up a ton. And finally, we're here. What does everything mean for teachers? I am preaching to the choir. I am fully aware of that. And I want every piece of feedback that those of you, especially those of you that have been teachers or are teachers, have about this experience, because your perspective is the perspective that makes this policy real. All of this creates pressures on teachers. It's connecting their performance with the performance of students on things like standardized tests, or they create standard-based grading, or they limit the flexibility to teach students with specific needs. This puts a lot of pressures on teachers to not only perform well and make sure their students are performing well, but also work within the restrictive regulatory system that has been created for them. They have to jump through all of these bureaucratic hurdles to be certified, as well as advocating for their student needs with the administrators and at the state level. They go through their unions. They'll constantly be fighting for new resources, new textbooks, new technology in the classroom, things that can help them help their students perform better. They constantly have to jump through the statutory regulatory system that we've created. And finally, it's all about their motivations, right? Despite everything that we're putting in their way, despite all of these different pressures, all of the different red tape that we're throwing in teachers' way, they still drive the learning process through personal motivation, through some external, internal motor that is pushing them there. So let's talk a little bit about that motor. We're going to treat teachers as public servants. Teachers are often, as I've talked about before, education policy is kind of a weird, second cousin of public policy overall, because it does have such a technical component to it, and entirely different programs to discuss education, education administration, education policy, separate from traditional public policy. But I'm erasing that. I'm going to treat teachers as public servants, as bureaucrats, right? The nasty B word, teachers are bureaucrats. So, at this point, please pause the video and read Perry and Weiss. It is not long. Yes, it's a little academic. It's very academic, but it's really important, and I'm going to be digging into what Perry and Weiss talked about, and this is part of your reading response, so make sure that you've at least skimmed it before you keep watching the video here. So, public service motivation theory. One of my favorite things to talk about, right? So the Hawthorne studies. The Hawthorne studies were this incredibly important psychological work psychology studies in the 1920s and the 1930s that essentially said, like, hey, maybe we aren't just cogs in a machine. Maybe people are motivated by other things other than producing the best product out of their assembly line, right? The Hawthorne studies massively changed the way that public administration scholars and public administration practitioners discussed motivations for their employees. Essentially, what came out of this was this idea that why is someone driven to work for the public sector? In a similar way that we talked about military or police officers, they're driven, they've long been theorized to have this different external altruistic motivation, right? Most of the time, research has shown that pay, personal success, and recognition are the key motivators for people, for most workers. But they haven't found that same thing within public sector workers. So what instead is motivating them? And this kind of debate raged back and forth, and right before the new public management revolution in the 1990s, Perry and Weiss came out with their seminal work on what motivates public sector employees, called public service motivation theory, or PSM theory. PSM theory is rooted in an old school concept known as the public service ethic, which is essentially saying that people who work in the public sector are driven by commitment to the public good and to do what's right. This isn't something that was necessarily nested in a ton of empirical research, more in this idea that, like, well, you want to serve your country, right? Or you want to serve your community. You want to do what's right. The competing theory for this that came up, and we talked about it. Theory we talked about with Friedman is public choice theory. It's a complementary theory to rational choice theory that says essentially everyone's motivated by personal gain. Everyone is a selfish actor, and the public choice theory movement gave rise to the trope that we often think about as the selfish, wasteful bureaucrat. Public service motivation theory says, well, that's not actually true. Public service motivation says not only are they not selfish, wasteful actors in it for their own gain, but they actually challenge the basic assumptions of rational choice theory by saying that those who work in the public sector are driven by other goals beyond those personal selfish desires. So what are those personal selfish, or what are those desires if they're not personal and selfish? Well, Perry and Weiss throw out three different types of motivation. So the first is rational. This is the idea that people are rationally drawn to make good public policy either because they have a personal connection to the field they work in or because they have a special interest in that field, right? So a great way to think about this is that you may want to be a teacher because your parents were teachers or because you had a particularly important mentor throughout your schooling experience that motivated you to be a teacher. Or this might be something where you go and work for an agency like Child Welfare Services because you were a child who went through that process and you want to make it better. You have a specialized interest in that, right? They also posit the norm-based motivation. This is the value idea. This is, I think, the hoity-toity version of this, right? That people have these personal values such as patriotism or loyalty to their country or community or promoting social equity that really drives them to work in the public sector. This is saying, like, I really truly believe in the American dream, and therefore I want to work in teaching, in education to help other people realize the American dream. And then there's the affective. So this is affective in terms of psychologically affective, not the verb. It is that people hold these predetermined idealistic beliefs, right, about what their program is meant to do, their agency is meant to do, or their country, and they're motivated to promote to support those beliefs through their action. So it may be a belief in, I hold a personal connection and a deeply held personal belief in the value of a public education. And so it would make sense for me to take positions, work in ways that follow that same belief. Perry and Wise argue that these motivations are either completely unique or predominantly seen exclusively in public servants. So this is not something that if you work in the private sector, you cannot have this. Or if you work in nonprofits, you cannot have this. This is essentially saying that these are the things that we see most of the time with public servants. Okay, step out of theory and let's get down to why this matters. What is PSM theory in practice, right? Well, Perry and Wise throw out these three larger ideas that have later been supported by research and explored in much greater detail if you really want to fall down that rabbit hole. Well, the first is that we assume that PSM is this essentially this bar, this sliding scale in everyone's head, and you can either have a high PSM or a low PSM. And Perry and Wise say that the greater someone's personal public service motivation, the more likely they are to be drawn to work for a public organization. So identifying those with a high PSM helps recruiting, hiring, and retention. So if you are able to isolate that, it would help you hire and retain high quality employees who are actually driven to align with your work. In public organizations as well, this has been backed up by a lot of research that the higher your PSM, it is positively connected to personal performance. So this is essentially saying if you work for a public organization, you have a high public service motivation, you are going to perform better than someone in the same organization with a low public service motivation. This is really important for us understanding, how do we make sure our employees are aligning well with their work? We talked a little bit about that with with principals and superintendents, right? Aligning their values, our expectations with the work they're getting, right? And then finally, this one, hear me out. It's a little complex, but public employees with a high public service motivation are generally less reliant on utilitarian incentive structures. What this means is that managers often have to go out of their way to create incentive structures to motivate their employees to work towards a common goal, a utilitarian goal. What public service motivation theory posits is that managers don't have to do that if their employees are already public service motivated. They internally already have that utilitarian mindset in mind. So you don't have to spend the resources getting people on the same page like that. That's huge, and it makes for a more efficient workplace if you are able to identify those with a high public service motivation. And so we apply it to teachers. So this is been done since Perry and Wise first had this discussion. But and there's different levels or different ways. Again, whole rabbit hole you can fall down. But what I want to do is I want to take what explanatory power and policy implications there is from applying public service motivation theory to teachers. So researchers have found that teachers don't have a different level of public service motivation than other public sector employees. However, there is, as strong as it gets, a high correlation between a teacher's public service motivation level and their performance and retention in their workplace. So teachers with a higher public service motivation are going to perform better, according to a lot of this research that's been done internationally. Policymakers and the general public more broadly assume that teachers have this incredibly high level of public service motivation, and that teachers will overcome the push factors, the things that are pushing them out of their jobs, created by policies and managerial decisions. So when a policymaker is choosing to cut education funding or to change the way that teachers are certified or anything like that, there is an intrinsic belief that because teachers are so motivated by this altruistic desire to educate their children, that it doesn't matter what the consequences of our policies are on them personally, because they're going to overcome that specific push factor. And because of this, we put an inordinate amount of pressure on teachers to continue to perform at a high level, regardless of what other things we have put in their way. This is my thesis. We have pushed teachers too far. Teachers, more than any other group in American domestic policy, that's anything that is not foreign policy, right? Teachers are the single most important group of bureaucrats in all of American domestic policy. The reason why I posit this is that there's no other type of public servant, there's no other position that is more consistently scapegoated by policymakers for performance largely out of their control. We've talked a lot about how, we need to support and view children and students as a holistic being, instead of trying to isolate whether or not they can do well on the test or not, right? But we treat teachers as if students performing poorly on the test is a personal failure for them. There's also no other group of public servants that has had their roles and responsibilities so consistently expanded without being provided the additional resources necessary to accommodate that. Teachers now are expected to not only provide a high quality education, but they're expected to provide food for students who may not have been able to eat at home. They're required to be social workers and understand the student's unique needs. They're required to be child psychologists and try to figure out and support students in the unique way that they need if they have traumas or disadvantages being placed on them. They're also expected to be literal protectors of their students against violence. Right? They are expected. There's policymakers that want them to carry guns because that is now another responsibility. None of those responsibilities have come with increased resources. And then as a sector, in education, the lack of resources should have crippled American education. American public education should have died. It frankly should have been gone by now. By the time A Nation at Risk came out, regardless of what you think of the validity of their arguments, American education was falling so far behind the rest of the world in the measures that they chose to use that it is a miracle that our education system persisted in the same manner that it did. I argue that because of teachers' motivations, because of that unique drive that they have overcome everything that has been put in their way, and that unique passion has kept our system afloat. That is my theory. That is the thesis for the second part of this class. That is one of my overall theses for the class overall. education should be dead. It should have been completely revamped. There should have been a revolution. There should be completely different systems. But because of the unique passion and drive of teachers as public servants, because of their commitment to the practice and the art of education, it hasn't. What I want to posit right now, give everyone a chance to kind of chew on it. When I talked about the death spiral, the funding death spiral, I asked a question of like whether or not this is intentional, right? Is this something that policymakers want to happen? Is this something that is an intended outcome? I want you all to be thinking now, how do teachers play into something like the death spiral? Think about it on the ground level. You all have done a really good job of taking this and applying it at the really ground level, but think about specifically with the funding death spiral. When a school performs poorly, what happens to those teachers? What impact do they have on the spiral? So let's talk about the teacher shortage. This is the final straw. The impending teacher shortage, every single one of you has mentioned it at some point in a reading response or in a meeting with me. This is a crisis. We are reaching a breaking point. So what is our teacher shortage and why do we have it? So this is something, we've had a teacher shortage for more than 20 years at this point. They essentially say that you measure the teacher shortage by whether or not there are adequate teachers to serve the number of students that they have. Our student population has continued to increase. The number of teachers hasn't necessarily increased at that same rate, meaning that teacher-student ratios, of classroom ratios, have increased without the resources to keep up with it. So teachers are teaching more students with more diverse needs without the additional resources that they need to support those additional students and additional needs. Teacher shortages are also not equally distributed. These well-funded suburban schools have less issues with staffing. We talked about Aurora at the beginning of this class, right? Aurora, frankly, doesn't have as severe of a staffing issue of a teacher crisis as other either highly urban or highly rural districts because of the size of the district, their relative suburban status, and they're relatively decently funded in comparison to other districts, right? The root cause of our teacher shortage, the root cause of this increase in teacher-student ratios, the unequal effects and distributions of the teacher shortage, is rooted in the logic of education policy making, right? Underperforming schools receive less funding and are expected to do better. That is what our system has created. All the way from the every student succeed, or not every student, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, all the way through to No Child Left Behind, to Every Student Succeeds, to Race to the Top, all have contributed to this logic that when a school performs poorly, their funding is lessened, is restricted. Teachers are faced with more pressure in that situation to help their students succeed, and also from a personal self-preservation to keep their schools open. While all of their resources, such as counseling, extracurricular activities, technology in the classroom, high-quality curriculum for them to work off, all of that actually has a key impact on student performance and student success, all of that declines at the same time. The logic here is simple. With other public goods, such as something like public safety, funding increases when issues arise. Let's talk about that for a second. I want to compare this directly to public safety. This is talking about police, crime, right? So here's the logic of policymakers when they make policy for public safety. Crime increases in an area. I work in a city, in Commerce City, that crime has increased. What the response has been is that we don't blame police departments for the crime increases, and instead we look at those external causes, like, we blame immigration, we blame drug problems, and we even sometimes blame a poor education for the rise in crime. Therefore, we then support the police department with more resources to respond to the issue. We don't say that crime has risen and therefore we take away your funding. But that is what we would say if we took the same logic that we use for education policy making and applied it to public safety. So crime goes up. The first thing we do is we label the police department as ineffective, and we have to turn around the crime issue, right? They have 5 years to turn around the crime issue. Because of this ineffectiveness, police departments' budgets are cut. We don't want them wasting our resources. If they're not good at preventing crime, why do we want to give them more money? And then we measure their performance. We take away their funding, we expect their performance to improve. And if their performance doesn't improve, then police departments are taken over by the private sector. We bring in Blackwater, we bring in these private companies to run our police departments. That's insane, right? That's crazy. But that is how we treat the schools. That is what teachers deal with on a day-to-day basis. That is the system. In this system, where we have these professionals who have high levels of public service motivation, teachers internalize the failures of their students and their schools. This is a personal psychological effect that has contributed to what a lot of psychology researchers are calling burnout. It's something that we all experience. It's becoming more popular in our lexicon. The idea that we're internalizing our work. We're tying our psychological health, our personal mental health, to the success of our work. Teachers, as we've talked about, don't have as much power over the overall success of the education system, yet they internalize it just the same. On top of all of that, teacher wages have also stagnated. You know, we've got this system where we're reducing resources for underperforming schools. We have a high level of burnout. We also have wages stagnating. Not only have wages not kept up with inflation, like most wages haven't, but teachers make around 19% less than similarly educated professionals of the same age. States have the most control over teacher pay. That most of the funding coming from the federal government goes to grants that are for infrastructure for curriculum that does not are not applicable to teachers, and so a lot of that funding comes from the state. Colorado ranks bottom 3 in teacher pay. So as much as Aurora can sit there and brag about their 8.5% raise, which is great for those teachers, it is still significantly lower. They said in that article, regardless of this pay increase, it's still hard to afford to be a teacher in Colorado. This is something that teachers deal with on a day-to-day basis. And you've probably heard that, you know, this is something that, you know, my wife, who is an incredibly passionate teacher, her parents have told her, like, you chose to go into a low-paying profession, therefore you don't get to complain about your low pay. And finally, teacher autonomy has also lessened. As these reform policies have come up, there's more restrictions and more regulations on what can be taught and how it can be taught. Starting with No Child Left Behind, but this also comes through with pressures from parents as well, against things like critical race theory and sexual education, everything like that. All of this is creating a dynamic that is becoming more and more untenable for teachers to palate. So now we have a new teacher shortage. It's not just the 20 years of underpaying and increasing regulations. The pandemic has created entire new pressures to contend with: remote learning and personal safety. The initial solution during the pandemic, which I think was the best solution out of all of the terrible bad solutions we had, was the only thing that we could do, right? We couldn't safely put kids in school, so we did remote learning. And we asked teachers to adequately educate students through online means that most of them had not been trained on. There's no additional resources or support. There wasn't additional professional development opportunities for teachers to teach online, especially right away. Yet they're still expected for their students to continue to learn at that same level. Then schools returned to in-person learning, and there were various levels of protection. It was left to districts for the most part. Many schools required masks, required their teachers to be vaccinated, and others didn't. Thinking all the way back to week 1, We all know that protests have broken out over mask and vaccine requirements. This idea that teachers are being put back in the classroom, they don't have an option to work from home. They don't have an option. So if their district does not provide masks, does not have a vaccine requirement, does not require anything, and adequately enforce that, teachers are putting their own personal health on the line on top of the gun violence issue we already know is a problem, right? And throughout all of this, school funding stagnated or even dropped, and teacher pay continued to be abysmal. This was the final straw. And what are the implications? Teachers are leaving the profession at record levels. A study conducted by the Colorado Educators Association, the main union, said that 2/3 of teachers are considering leaving the profession. That is not good, to say the least. And frankly, this could be catastrophic. Schools are already struggling with staffing levels, and to, as Superintendent Munn said, attract high quality staff, right? The problems concentrate themselves in rural areas, highly urban areas, where schools are already receiving less funding due to their poor performance. And then, without significant changes, education in America will worsen well beyond where RISC thought we were going to be back in 1983. We are pushing out the people who have protected us from the consequences of our continued underfunding and mistreatment of schools. We're pushing those people out of the classroom. The other component of my argument, and excuse my soapbox, but the reason why I assigned Abrams specifically, this specific book, is because our continued treatment of schools, similar to or exactly like private sector entities, has led us here. Abram calls it the commercialization of schools. This completely misaligns with the motivations of teachers. Districts that have severely underperformed, like Detroit Public Schools, have been taken over by people and are now led by CEOs. And like we talked about last week, a lot of administrators without even teaching experience. What do we know teachers are motivated by? We know they're motivated by these idealistic understanding and care for their students, and yet we're treating them more and more like traditional employees. We've also continued to embed private sector into the education policies of our schools. And now we position teachers and schools not as victims of a poorly constructed system, but as perpetrators of an ineffective, inefficient system of their own making. Adams 14 is failing because Adams 14 was bad at their job. That is how we position it. Those administrators, those teachers have failed those students. That is the argument. This backwards policy making are both a cause of the logic and an effect of the logic. Schools and teachers need more help, but all they've gotten is more blame. Teachers and schools that are performing below standards are not the same as a failing business that should just leave. Competition, commercialization, privatization, this rhetoric has led us here. This has created the web of our system. What needs to be done? Well, frankly, there are no small solutions that are going to fix this crisis. Teachers are leaving the classroom for a plethora of reasons, well beyond an 8.5% raise, well beyond specific issues with masks or vaccines. It is generations of mistreatment, of trauma, of scapegoating, of blame, everything. No small solution is going to save this. We need large-scale fixes. These are systemic issues. They are built into our education system. Teacher pay increases, to start, are necessary but not sufficient. We are bleeding teachers, and that's something that Aurora is acknowledging, and they're hoping to stop it before it becomes a bigger issue by increasing teacher pay. But this is not sufficient if we're not also improving working conditions, we're not also improving the management of teachers, and also further subsidizing high quality teacher preparation programs in colleges. Another large scale solution is decoupling school funding and accountability. If we continue this trend of taking a poorly performing school and linking their funding with their performance, we will continue to worsen the problem. If a failing school has their funding taken away, they cannot be expected to do better. This will require large-scale reforms of our modern education policies, especially No Child Left Behind, but Every Student Succeeds, Race to the Top, our reliance on Common Core, all connects this, all creates this network that even if one state wanted to fix it, they could, because the way that No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds are written is that you must hold schools accountable for their performance through funding. States also need to completely revamp their school funding formulas. There needs to be more equitable funding to all schools to meet each school's unique needs. One part of this problem is that there just needs to be a larger pool of money to draw from. States like Colorado have such poor school funding for larger tax policy implications that I will happily ramble on about for hours and hours. But it requires a larger investment overall, but it also requires specific targeted funding for these highly urban and rural schools, as well as support for schools with high levels of multilingual learners, high levels of students with special needs, and high levels of students that are disadvantaged. It goes beyond Title I schools anymore. There are additional resources that need to be directed and targeted very specifically that right now our funding formulas just don't do enough to account for. And finally, perhaps the biggest problem of all is that the nation needs to completely revamp the way that we think and treat children in education. As long as childhood poverty, childhood hunger, abuse, chronic absenteeism, homelessness, every single systemic issue, as long as those continue, we cannot expect improved educational outcomes. What we have done is we have said conditions have gotten worse for students in our country, particularly students that have specific specialized needs, students in low-income areas, students with abusive parents, students with without stable housing, and we have continued to say, well, teachers need to do more. They need to do better. That's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Education is a public good, and it's time we treat it that way. So what conclusions can we draw, right? Teachers are central to the education system. And just like you would have no public safety policy without police officers doing it, you have no education policy without teachers implementing it. Teachers also sit in a very unique, powerful, highly visible position that's unique to the education system overall. Teachers are motivated to serve their students in a way that has held the education system together, but with increased pressures, decreased funding, and worsening work conditions, teachers are leaving the profession in droves, and it's only going to get worse. The consequences of this departure could be existential for our education system. Here are the guiding questions I want you to be thinking about. What motivates teachers? What are those motivations? Think about the different types of motivations that Perry and Weiss talked about, and how do they apply to teachers? If you are a teacher, have been a teacher, how have those motivations, does that align with you? Does that not align with you? Why is it important for both policymakers and administrators to understand their teachers' motivations? Where do teachers sit in the education financing system as well? We know that they don't have a ton of power to influence it, but how do teachers impact education financing? How do they contribute to or work to prevent the funding death spiral, right? And then how can policymakers respond to this teacher shortage? And what are the consequences? You may not believe it's as existential as me. I sure hope it's not as existential as it is, as I believe it is. But what are the consequences if we don't fix it? Where are we going? What is our our education system in 10, 20, 30 years if we don't fix this problem? All right. So I will talk a little bit about final projects here in a second, but I want to make sure that we all have this outlined. Perry and Wise, great one. Please use it to personally reflect on your motivations. As if you're a teacher, personally reflect on the motivations of teachers you know. And it's talking about Teach for America, and I know at least one of you is a Teach for America alumnus, and so I can't wait to hear how you believe that Teach for America fits into the system. Are their motivations different? Is there something inherently that different between a Teach for America teacher and a traditionally educated teacher? And does that change motivations? Goldstein talks in detail about that, so I can't wait to read your responses on that. Remember, it's due on Sundays now. And then complete your Week 9 readings. Olson and Setston, Garcia and Weiss, both great readings. A little heavier, that's why there are only 2. Then there's also our optional readings and those optional videos as well. Final project is due 8/1. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the final exam will be that final week, released on 8/1, due 8/5. I'm going to have a way more structure to follow kind of the pedagogical approach I've taken to the lectures so far. The final exam prompts are going to be much more structured and I think take you less time than the midterms did as well. No one should be worrying about that. The study guide will be coming out this week as well. So it will be part of a separate video. I will be interviewing my wife, talking about teachers and kind of those major themes we talked about. So that will be posted in a separate video. Before we leave here, I do want to talk about the final project. You guys are all set up really well for the final project right now. You really are. I do genuinely believe that. And so what I want to go over real quick is just the structure and everything like that. So a lot of this is a repeat. It kind of talks about what the purpose of policy analyses are. Remember that, with Honig and Coburn, right, evidence-based decision-making is important, and things like these policy analyses can be used as the legal justification for actions taken by administrators, right? So here are your headers. This is the structure I strongly recommend you take. These are the things I'm going to be looking for. If you want to deviate, totally fine. Just know that I'm expecting each and every one of these things. So we have an executive summary, a little bit of a background, the issue summary, which a lot of you have done most of right now, an institutional summary, which a lot of you have done most of, methodology, your analysis itself, and your recommendations. So executive summary, make sure that's written last. You do not write your executive summary before you're done with your paper. You're supposed to summarize the entire paper, so you can't write it before you're done, right? Only one paragraph, high level, not super important, right? Background, this is a compelling narrative that is trying to position why you're writing this and what the importance of this particular analysis and solving this particular issue is, either for your district or for your state or for the country that you're talking about, right? This is the why of your paper. Make it compelling, make it interesting. This also should not be more than 2 pages. Of course, it can be more, but I want to make sure that you all know that this is not something that needs to be super lengthy. It's just kind of positioning your research, right? Then the issue summary, we've talked about this. I'll leave this here. No minimum or maximum. Make sure it comprehensively covers your issue. Institutional summary, this one should be closer to 2 or 3 pages. I also talked, if you're doing a school district, talk about the specific populations and resources, states, roles, powers, that sort of stuff, federal, that sort of stuff. Also remember to contextualize the powers and limitations of your institution. If I was writing a paper on how Aurora Public Schools is solving the teacher shortage, I would have to say that raising teacher pay is well within their power, but they only have so much money to raise teacher pay in, right? And so that's a limitation that they have. Then comes methodology. Here is the meat. This is something that you are going to take many classes throughout the PPA program that are going to really flesh out your ability to construct these analytical criteria and measure them in a highly rigorous, highly effective way. What I am going to do is I'm going to simplify that for you. In the methodology section, you need to both select your analytical criteria and define them. So the 4 criteria I recommend, the ones that I will be expecting unless you have a reason to deviate: efficiency, effectiveness, political feasibility, and legality, right? For each criteria, define the criteria as objectively and clearly as possible. So what does efficiency mean for your policy options? And how are you going to compare them? Are you going to rank them? Is it going to be a quantitative thing? How does that work, right? Efficiency is generally what are you getting per dollar spent. I would either quantitatively define that or rank it. Effectiveness, is the policy actually solving the problem it should? Either quantitatively or ranked. Political feasibility, way more subjective. How will the policy have to be made, and are the actors that have to make it willing to do it? Generally, I like to rank this. You can also do a dichotomy, like a yes, it's feasible, or no, it's not feasible. Just make sure you justify it. And then legality. This is a simple yes or no. Are there legal issues that this solution will run into? This is a dichotomy. Are there potential issues? You do not need to understand the legal issues, but if you are using a policy from a district out in Oregon, and that district in Oregon was sued 80 times for doing this policy, you want to make sure that you know that that's going to happen. That's a possibility, right? Just because something may run into legal issues does not mean that it is not the best option. It's just for full context for your institution, a great thing to talk about. So then we have our policy analysis. This is going to be more than 5 pages. This is where you're outlining your policy alternatives. Remember, I'm looking for at least 3. Status quo, no change. A limited and a conservative, or a limited/conservative option. What is a smaller solution to the problem? Then what's the aggressive liberal option, right? Where you're really going out there. And there might be others. Completely up to you. For each option, what I'll be looking for is for you to outline the alternative, what it actually does, and what other institutions have selected that alternative. Remember, art and a science, right? Sometimes you're going to find a solution that's not been tried. That's okay. Just make sure you justify why you selected it as an alternative. And then finally, for each policy option, discuss in narrative form how it fits each criteria. Is this something that is, how effective is this and why? How efficient is this and why? How politically feasible is this and why? Is it going to run into legal issues? Why? That sort of stuff. Make sure for each of your solutions you're deeply diving into that. What we're trying to do with this particular section is present a variety of options and analyze them using the rules we set out with our methodology section that will make it as objective and rigorous as possible. That is what these analyses do, and that's why they are so valuable. We do not make up our mind ahead of time. You do not know what your policy solution, your selected policy solution is until you have written this section. And then finally, the recommendation. Super simple. After discussing the alternatives, put them into your matrix, and then justify what you're choosing. Tell people why you're choosing the option you're choosing, right? Again, this is a basis of skills. I am not going to be really diving in and peer reviewing your methodology or anything like that. I really just want you to get a taste for what this feels like and apply it to the concepts, the issues, and the institutions that we have explored within education policy. That rubric will be coming out this week, as will the study guide for the final project. I want to thank you all. We are nearing the end of the course. I'm very sad. I also feel as though we have not done nearly enough and talked about nearly. There's so many things we could have talked about, and but I think that every single one of you has taken from our course the abilities to do those deep dives and to talk about those additional issues that I really didn't get to talk about a ton, right? And so, after this week, we're going to do some lighter lectures, lighter readings. Should be a lot simpler, lighter prompts for our reading responses, and then we'll move into our final project and our final exam, and then summer session is over. So I want to thank you all. Please make sure you click off of this video and go in and watch the interview I conduct with my wife, because I do think that the her perspective is a very good perspective, and it has mirrored a lot of the conversations that many of you have had in your reading responses talking about the effect of teachers. Thank you all. We'll talk soon.